Uganda remains one of the largest recipients of U.S. military aid in Africa, 22 years after the deadly terror attacks that toppled the World Trade Center towers in New York, an event that turned the East African nation as one of the Western powers' major proxies in the fight against terror. According to recently declassified data from the U.S. State Department from 2019 to 2021, Uganda received military training assistance from the U.S. worth $8.4 million, the equivalent of 31.3 billion shillings. It trailed Nigeria and Chad, afflicted by the Boko Haram insurgency and political instability, Kenya, which faces the threat of al-Shabaab insurgents from the neighboring Somalia, and Niger, convulsed by terror activities in the Sahel and a recent coup that ousted its leader Mohamed Bazoum. In aggregate dollar terms, the top 5 recipients of military training assistance from the U.S. to Africa between 2019 and 2021 were Nigeria, which received $13,590,000 US dollars, Kenya, which received $12,996,000, Chad, which received $9,344,000, and Uganda, which received $8,488,000. Though Uganda's halo may have slipped in the eyes of the West recently as a result of its stained human rights record and democratic credentials, it appears that President Museveni remains a key ally of the United States and its point man in the volatile Great Lakes region.
Museveni is the quintessential comprador, is the quintessential colonial emissary of our time. And the colonial power of our time is the United States. Museveni is ready to work for them. All right? And you need to understand the space in which Museveni operates is that he so powerfully understood that for you to stay in power, for the sake of staying in power, just please the geopolitical power of the time. And that he has done unreservedly. And I think the Americans are very grateful for his services and they're to continue working with him.
For instance, on the eve of one of the most violent elections in Uganda's post-independence era, Uganda received $5,307,476, the equivalent of 19.7 billion shillings, in military training assistance from the U.S., which was the highest among the 46 African nations that received such assistance that fiscal year. In comparison, Nigeria received $5,165,515 and Kenya received $5,173,733 during this time. This assistance went towards training 5,021 personnel in military professionalization, adherence to human rights, peacekeeping, border security, and transnational threats. UPDF and the Defense Ministry spokesperson, Brigadier Felix Kulaije, revealed in detail the nature of the training assistance Uganda received from the U.S.
The biggest component of that 5,000 has been the peacekeeping operations in Somalia, because we had US support for the training in peacekeeping operations that takes place in our Peace Support Training Center in Singo. 2 civil affairs officers did support civil military relations trainings.
According to data from the Defense Security Corporation Agency, between 2012 and 2016, Uganda received grants for defense equipment worth $21,975,492, whereas this is dwarfed by the $192.8 million Nigeria received over the same time period. It is significantly more than the $17.6 million Djibouti, a major U.S. ally in the Horn of Africa enclave, received during that time. The equipment included mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicles. Critics of the regime argue that this military support has entrenched the government and led to a clampdown of civil liberties and egregious human rights abuses, especially of opposition politicians.
20 years down the road, the Taliban are taking over Kabul, and Biden says, okay, the buck stops with me. No more boots on the ground. We're back to Mogadishu, 1991. And what does that mean? Aggrandized proxy and Uganda's geostrategic importance is all the more emphasized and all the more appreciated. And so human rights are not apolitical. Human rights are not acontextual. Human rights are not ahistorical. On the balance sheet of power, human rights falls on the liability. The big asset of power accumulation can afford to trump over human rights, because when human rights concerns meets geopolitical concerns, the latter trumps the former.
At a recent rally in Mbale, new party leader Bobby Wine called for the US to halt providing the Ugandan government with military assistance.
This is a message to the Americans. We are not asking for help from you. We are asking you, stop sponsoring the dictator.
Kulaije rejects this view.
Our government has not been entrenched by Western Alliance. It's been entrenched by the electorate of Uganda. So to undermine the power of the vote is a product of a neo-colonized mind, who think you must endear yourself to the West in order to govern your country.
Yusuf Serunkuma, a political analyst, reckons that the US-Uganda military ties are evidence of a symbiotic relationship that doesn't serve the interests of Ugandan citizens.
As long as it remains friendly to Euro-America, that's all that matters. It doesn't matter whether you stop Chagulanyi from marching to Kampala. It doesn't matter, as long as it remains friendly to Euro-America, right? So, I think one of the delusions of us as Africans is that we fail to understand that we are still a colonized continent. That most of what looks like internal matters are concluded and negotiated elsewhere.
According to the author Helen Epstein, in a book titled Another Fine Mess, America, Uganda and the War on Terror, shortly after the 9/11 attacks, Museveni hired Rosa Whittaker, a shrewd, Bible-quoting African-American lobbyist and former assistant trade representative in the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations, to promote his image in Washington as an expert on the Somalia situation. In 2003, Whittaker arranged Museveni's White House visit and sent letters reminding State Department officials that Museveni was strongly supporting the U.S. in the global war against terrorism. Soon Bush and Museveni were speaking frequently by telephone. Serunkuma, a political analyst, reflects on the Uganda political context in which U.S.-Uganda military ties were forged at the onset of the war on terror.
Now, 2001 was manna to Museveni. It was a gift to Museveni. Because around that time, you need to remember that we had just gone through the 2001 election. And Bestie had given him a bloody nose, right? And I think, normally superpowers are often tinkering with politics on the African continent. So they were tinkering with the possibility of Besigye, being prepared as a potential replacement for Mr. Museveni. And Bestie has documented this stuff in his book, The Kalinaki wrote, right? How the convention was passed up, then 9/11 happened. And Museveni grabbed this opportunity to position himself as an anti-terror, an anti-terrorism, outpost of the American government.
Critics prefer that this war on terror has turned into a boon for Uganda to pursue a game of brinkmanship in its military adventures across the Great Lakes and Horn of Africa. For instance, in 2019, a year in which Uganda received 9.2 billion shillings in military training assistance, there was public outcry regarding the conduct of military personnel during interventions in civil matters. These concerns were reflected in a motion passed by the 10th Parliament in December 2019 to inquire into the conduct of the UPDF during deployment in civil matters, following allegations of gross human rights violations. During the House sitting on 11th December 2019, the then Speaker Rebecca Kadaga revealed that she had received threats for her criticism of the army. The inquiry subsequently came to naught. 2 years earlier, security operatives had raided Parliament in September 2017 during a debate on the constitutional amendment to lift the age restrictions that barred President Museveni from running for president. Kulaije says the UPDF's record of upholding human rights compares favorably with that of its allies in the West.
Which army observes human rights more than UPDF? across the region. Because even when individuals among us misbehave, because they do, we take them to task, we take them to book. We are the only army that has executed its own 126. Just give me one soldier from the US who was executed for violating human rights. And you know they did. In Iraq, they have done so. In Vietnam.
Uganda has benefited from its close ties with the US military in the last 2 decades of the war on terror. However, this has come at a great cost domestically, with curtailed freedoms and a democratic deficit in the face of unchecked militarization, critics opine.